Ambassador Power, welcome. And
Thank
we
you.
are so thrilled to welcome you to the Albright Institute, and thank you for being our distinguished visitor.
I do anything Madeleine Albright tells me to do.
Me too.
I have one rule in life, and that is it.
She is truly a force, but the most positive. I thought we'd just start by talking a little bit about your life. You were raised in Ireland, and many people may not know, but that you originally wanted to become a journalist. And as I read it, Tiananmen Square played an important role as you thought about your path. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure, I'm like a lot of young people, of course. I had no fixed sense of what I wanted to be, but when I moved to America as a 9-year-old, I moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and it was the year the Pittsburgh Pirates won the World Series and the Pittsburgh Steelers won the Super Bowl. So I became a sports nut because that was my way of fitting in. And when I got to college, I decided I'll be a sports reporter because I love sports, I love playing sports, I love watching sports. And it could be that that would have carried me away and carried me forward, and I'd be doing play-by-play now somewhere in some obscure local radio station somewhere in the country. But the summer after my freshman year, I was working at the CBS local affiliate in Atlanta, which is where I'd gone to high school. And as I was taking notes on a Braves-Padres game, in order to cut the evening news, the sports highlights, the little package for the evening news, the footage from Tiananmen Square came down. And this had been a very hopeful time. Not only were you starting to see the cracks in communism in Eastern Europe, but students had been out protesting for weeks in China to demand greater freedoms and democratization, liberalization. And the moment, though, that I was sitting there was a very ugly moment where the tanks came into the square and basically mowed over a large number of students, and then the screen went black. It was a very dramatic moment, and I was sort of sitting there with the clipboard where I was faithfully taking notes on who hit a home run and who made an error and a funny person in the crowd, and I just thought, you know, there's an awful lot going on in the world. Maybe I could at least try to learn more and to see, is there something to be done that's going to be more impactful in the world. But it's, you know, there's a big leap between kind of letting yourself try to learn more and actually believing yourself capable of making a difference. And I know a lot of students here and where I teach, you know, we have these thought bubbles that are filled with doubts about whether the world's problems are just so big. Is there anything we ourselves can do? So it was a long time before, I mean, even to this day, you know, one asks oneself, am I making a sufficient difference? But the first thing is to just have that motivation and to try.
So what was your first step into public policy?
Out of college, I received an internship at a place called the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And my political consciousness after the Tiananmen thing had kind of evolved, and I would say I was at Yale, and there was a progressive political culture there, and I would have leaned progressive, been pretty skeptical about American power and, you know, kind of typical sort of progressive campus politics evolving. And then out of college, I went to work for a man who'd worked in the U.S. government as a diplomat for more than 3 decades. And he had just come out of Turkey, where he'd been ambassador, and he had helped facilitate or urge the creation of a protected zone in northern Iraq for the Kurds. You might remember back in the early 90s after the Gulf War. And so suddenly I was working with somebody who spoke of American power and the American military as this force for good, and it had just succeeded in dislodging Saddam Hussein from Kuwait and in protecting the Kurds. And he was consumed with what was happening in Bosnia. And I had read so much about the Holocaust and the idea of never again. And here, just by virtue of working for him and trying to be just a faithful intern, I began reading about what was happening in the former Yugoslavia. And 50 years after the Holocaust, there were camps that were set up where women were systematically raped, where men were tortured and murdered. And Mort Abramowitz, this man, was part of a community in Washington that was advocating for the Clinton administration to do more to help these people. Madeleine Albright, of course, was within the Clinton administration, arguing, making the same case, but for several years, not successfully. And I decided, having worked for him for a year, to go and take the skills I thought I might have, having been a sports journalist, and see if there was a way to go to the region and tell the story of people who were being, they called it ethnically cleansed, victimized, shelled, sniped at on grounds of their ethnicity. And so I became what's called a stringer, a freelance journalist. I had strings attaching me to a number of publications around the world, from the Boston Globe and U.S. News and World Report to the Yorkshire Post. And I'd write for anybody who would take my prose. And then after a couple years, I just felt nothing we write is making a difference. And I left and I went to law school. But as I drove into Boston from New York, where my parents were living, I heard on the radio, quite literally, I'd come back from Bosnia maybe 3 days before, and as I drove, under Boston, the city of Boston, to get to Cambridge, where I was going to law school, I heard on the radio, the United States has intervened to try to bring the horrors to an end. And sure enough, I'd been at law school maybe 2 weeks, and the war was brought to an end by virtue of a successful intervention by the Clinton administration, which didn't put Bosnia back together again. It's still a very broken place all these years later, but it was an example, again, I think, of American power being harnessed for good.
Yeah. So that's really, so it's, again, that personal, that human interaction influenced by a person who is a leader. When you were in law school, you wrote the paper on genocide that led to your book, A Problem from Hell. And I'll tell you, that book was really, it won the Pulitzer Prize plus a number of other awards, and it was so impactful to me to read this story of genocide before we even knew it as genocide, from Armenia to Kosovo. Tell me what made you turn that paper into a book, and then what was that process like for you?
Well, first of all, thank you for reading the book back in the day. I was taking a class on the use of force and just war theory. Because again, this question of when is military force justified given all of the hazards associated with it was something that I still was kind of grappling with. I was decompressing from having been living in a war zone for a couple of years, and I was just trying to put what I had experienced in Bosnia in some historical context for this class on just war theory. And so I began looking. I went to Widener Library. Among the 3 million books there, I found books on prior cases of genocide, the Armenian genocide, what Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge had done in Cambodia, Saddam Hussein and the gassing of the Kurds. And I began to learn much more about Rwanda and the Rwandan genocide, which had happened while I was in Bosnia, and which I hadn't paid attention to, even though it was happening while I was a fully sentient adult. I was like, why are people paying attention to Rwanda? Bosnia's. So even I, claiming to care about mass atrocity, sort of put Rwanda in a box that I really regretted not having engaged on more while it was actually happening. So just to sort through, is there a pattern here? How do governments, and specifically my government, how do we respond in the face of mass atrocities? Is there any way that the atrocities themselves can kind of rise within the government to make policymakers roll up their sleeves and think, what can they do? And I did see a bit of a pattern. It was one that basically showed that unless there was really a direct nexus with our national security, we tended to look the other way. And yet the idea of never again as a kind of hopeful, forward-looking slogan persisted. So it was like we were looking away, but then we weren't quite noticing the record that we were amassing as we went. And so that puzzle, I think the best writing generally occurs when there's some question that you're kind of burning to understand, or there's a book that you want to read and you can no longer live with its absence. So in the case of this book, I kind of found myself starting with a paper for a class and then deciding to turn that paper into the book that I actually wanted to read myself. Had I known that the book would take 5 years to write, I probably would have been more cautious, but I have optimism bias generally, and so I always think I'm maybe a month or two away from completion, and that was my pattern over 5 years. And then, of course, when that book came out, there wasn't much expectation that it would be a widely read book, because it was a long book on a dark topic. But it was actually young people, fascinatingly, who grabbed it and who, I think, well and apart from the subject of genocide, the question of whether to be a bystander or an upstander in the face of what we see around us had a kind of universal resonance that I did not see coming. And so the book's reach and the fact that I'd go to college campuses and young people would have marked it up and they'd have Post-its in different colors. I could have never anticipated that, and I think it says more about the students and their idealism than even it says about the book. But one of the readers was not so young, and that was Barack Obama. Eventually found his way to the book, and then as soon as, not long after he'd been elected to the U.S. Senate, invited me to come and to talk with him about what we could do differently, or what he could do differently from the perch of the U.S. Senate to try to bring some of the ideas in there to life.
Did you find a resonance with him in those early years?
Definitely. I mean, first of all, he was the only U.S. Senator that called me and engaged me on the book, so it wasn't a special resonance compared to other senators. He was the only one who engaged with it that deeply. But what I liked about the way he thought about it, and this is how he thinks generally, but he thinks in terms of systems and in terms of structures, institutions, almost, there are a lot of really, really good people, really decent people who felt as strongly about the idea of never again as I would or you would or he did. And yet when these issues would confront them, it just kept happening. And so structurally, are there things that you can put in place in a bureaucracy to ensure that these issues rise? And moreover, putting the issue of genocide, which is a relatively rare case, what do we learn about the government generally and our ability to integrate concern for human consequences into our decision making? So whether we're talking about something that happens in Rwanda or something that happens in domestic policy, how can we ensure that the human beings at the heart of our policy efforts remain, at the center of our discussions? And you'd be surprised now, I've been in the government, how easy it is for these discussions to become divorced from the real people.
No, absolutely. So, just then fast forward a little bit. In 2013, you became the youngest ever U.S. ambassador to the UN and a member of President Obama's cabinet. Can you talk just a little bit about how you put some of that with President Obama into action and some of the things you're proud of achieving during those times?
It was the greatest privilege of my life to represent the United States. I was not the first immigrant to do it, as you know. Madeleine Albright had very proudly stood behind that placard and had been a real inspiration to me when I was in my early 20s, watching her duke it out with the boys up at the United Nations.
I'm going to ask you about that too.
I actually went to see her when President Obama named me, went to see Madeleine Albright, and she gave me multiple tips, but one of her tips was that when she had been ambassador, she looked around among the 183 countries at the UN and she noticed that she was one of 7 women ambassadors. So 7 countries out of 183 were represented by women. That was back in 1993. And she created something that she called the G7, the Girl 7.
Oh my gosh.
Which of course mirrored the group of 7, the actual G7. Of course. And it was a cross-regional, very small network, but they managed to get
I love it.
Real work done on behalf of women's empowerment and women's dignity around the world. And so she said, I think you should do the same. So I went and I created the G37. We were up to 37, but out of 193 countries 20 years later. And she was so right, if only just as a commiserative network, but also because we were able to push issues like sexual violence in peacekeeping and a whole bunch of other things, using the fact that we each came from so many different corners of the world. Because at the UN, countries tend to sort of aggregate within their regional groups, and it's very rare that you have a group like this that just cuts across geography and socioeconomics and so forth. But I'd say the sort of greatest moments for me representing the United States were when the United States was driving a coalition to an outcome. And so the best example of that is one that gets almost no attention in retrospect, which is President Obama's leadership in the face of the Ebola crisis. And it's typical.
Yeah.
When something gets dealt with, it's gone and nobody remembers it.
Right.
But if you bring yourself back to the level of fear and panic
Absolutely.
that existed in this country and all around the world, and above all in the communities that were affected in West Africa, the courage that President Obama showed sending the U.S. military into a public health mission of the kind that had never been seen before, in the face not only of Republican opposition to doing that, but also much Democratic concern.
Right.
And just, again, the fear, and now we live in a culture where fear is used as a weapon of politics much more often even than then, with migrants and refugees and being demonized and so forth. But you really saw, I think, in that clash of two visions about whether we are a country governed by fear or whether we believe in human solidarity, but also whether we believe what is factually true, which is that our fates are connected to the fates of people living very far away. So for the president to have led in that manner, sent troops and health workers into the eye of the storm, and then I, as the ambassador, to get to now say to every other country in the world, okay, this is what we're doing now, what are you doing?
Right.
That was a horrible circumstance for it to be happening, but just such a reminder of how indispensable American leadership is and what we can do when we lead a coalition. The Paris Agreement on Climate, of course, is another example. The ISIS coalition that we mobilized. There are a lot of different examples, but that one, because of the political thicket that he had to make his way through, I think I just felt especially proud to be representing him.
You know, as you talked a little earlier about systems, as you now reflect on our response to Ebola, I mean, these are the kinds of threats, you know, and these infectious disease threats, right? I mean, they are threats to security. They are major threats, and they have to work across those, whether, you know, it's various aspects of government, health workers, et cetera. Do you think out of that crisis that the world has looked differently at how to develop infrastructure or systems to kind of understand how to address it the next time? Because there will be a next time.
Well, already, you know, we have the second largest Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I think the fact that so many individuals who work for governments now have the muscle memory of having mobilized that coalition, that on the one hand, the answer is yes, that the preparedness is there, that some learning occurred. I think there have been reforms both at the UN in New York and also at the WHO. But one of the things that is definitely true about the state of our planet, unfortunately, at the present, is that coalitions come together through leadership. And there's no automaticity within the system. So yes, there's the muscle memory. Yes, there are the individuals who know where to go and what to do. But unless, for example, the U.S. Congress is prepared to come forward and allocate the funds, unless the President of the United States is prepared to instruct the Center for Disease Control, for example, to deploy into harm's way, you know, coalitions just don't coalesce on their own. And yes, much is made rightly about the rise of China, which is asserting itself much more within the international system. But if you were to see an Ebola crisis on the scale of what we saw in West Africa, we're not yet in a phase where China is going to perform the kind of leadership that the U.S. performed for more than 7 decades. And so our retreat now makes me worry, you know, who would the team captain be?
That's right.
Because you can have systems, and you can have well-trained individuals within systems, but you need leadership and a team captain.
Lots to think about. Any regrets?
You know, I have regrets about things that we as a government, you know, that I wish we had been more effective at. I mean, Syria is the obvious example. Half the population of that country displaced, really probably more than 400,000 people killed. And here I wrote the book on atrocity prevention and response, and nothing that we tried diplomatically in terms of sanctions worked, and yet the president was very much of the view that another exercise of military force in the Middle East after the Iraq War was unlikely to make a meaningful difference. But I think the knock-on effects of Syria including the mass migration into
Yeah.
Europe, and then all the political changes that have come about in Europe, where xenophobes have used migration and the Syrian refugee problem as a way of stoking fear. The knock-on effects from Syria are ones we're still living with. But my main regret is just that I don't get to still be in public service, frankly. I loved it. I think young people, for all of the sacrifice and hardship, because these are not full-time jobs, these are double full-time jobs, and the time away from family, the sense of meaning and purpose that one gets working as part of a team on behalf of one's country, or in service of, in attempt at service for other people, there's just nothing like it. And so I really hope, notwithstanding the fact that a lot of people are leaving government at the present, and the government is not necessarily talked about with the respect always that and public service is not talked about with the respect that I wish it were. I think there's going to be a real opportunity in a couple years to renovate and to replenish some of these institutions, and to bring in a whole new wave of talent.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to talk about that a little bit, because on the one hand, in our own country, there's this sense of a crisis around democracy. But on the other hand, we've seen a midterm election where we saw more women run than ever. Across all different types of elections, whether they be state or local or clearly for Congress. Where do you think we are? Where do you think the public mood is, and how do we navigate forward?
I think people are really conflicted right now. And it's almost like that battle in all of our heads between, oh my gosh, this stuff is happening. How are things that we never even imagined people would say, never mind do, happening in this incredible republic of ours? That on the one hand, and a kind of fear and, for some, despair, understandably, given some of the cruelty. And then another impulse, which is, well, I can sit here complaining about it, or I can do something. And what's been so beautiful in the last 2 years, really, since the last presidential election, is seeing how many people, notwithstanding their despair and their sadness and their shock, have channeled that into being activated themselves, whether that's just voting for the first time, or whether that's making themselves vulnerable by running for office. And it's been particularly inspiring, of course, to see women in those roles. And now it's going to be really interesting to see whether having women in more positions of power, whether on the school board or the city council or in the new Congress, whether we can use some of the qualities that we have, that we pride ourselves on, to also ensure that more is done from these institutions. Because I think, the despair comes in part from not liking any particular politician, but it also comes from just a more chronic sense that our institutions aren't delivering what we need them to deliver for people. And so, I really hope that out of I think one of the things that could really entrench that sense of empowerment and that sense of, if I want things to change, I have to be part of the change, is a positive feedback loop where people start to see a difference made. And I think we've already begun to see it in the wake of the midterm elections.
Absolutely. And I think it's a good way to shift over to your new book that you're writing, The Education of an Idealist. And I love the title.
Well, it's the Wellesley, its motto. It's what you're doing every minute of every day.
Absolutely. So tell us just a little bit about the book.
Well, it's, I feel very presumptuous having, I feel, not done enough to warrant writing a memoir, but it is a memoir looking at what it meant to come to this country as a child, embrace its traditions and its ideals, and then be a flamethrower outside government for many years as an activist and an advocate. And then to find myself suddenly in the belly of the beast, in the Situation Room, the room where it happens, with an intruder alert going off in my head, thinking, I'm in the meeting, I'm hearing, because I had been a journalist also trying to document what went on in those meetings. And then what did I learn on the back end? And there's a lot to say on that question. But the main feeling I have, I think, reflecting on this arc, is that I am, despite the refugee flow and the boiling planet and who our elected leaders are occasionally, but more idealistic now about the power of an individual to make change, whether using the power of the pen as a journalist or working within the halls of power than I was when I started. And I've learned a lot, of course, about how to do it. And so I think some people see the title of my book, The Education of an Idealist, and think, the old saying that a conservative is a liberal who's been mugged by reality.
Oh my goodness.
The only idealists get educated. You never read The Education of a Cynic, right? So an education necessarily means that I'm older, I'm wiser, I realize change is so hard, I might as well watch SportsCenter, No, it's much more, the education is much more about what are the tools we have and how do we do our best at least to transcend the obstacles. Because Lord knows there are a lot of obstacles that stand in the way, but that's not news. And the useful thing is to say, okay, what would I do differently this time around knowing what I know? So hopefully I can impart that. The audience is 100% young people, really. I just think about people who are starting out, have that dream, look around, think, things are messed up, I want to help. And then I want to spare them the bother of having to make some of the mistakes I made. And so hopefully this can be an accessible book where they see themselves in the journey.
Well, it will be powerful, and I just want to make sure you come back.
I'm coming back
when it's published, because it is so important. I mean, being on a college campus, it's really one of the most hopeful places you can be. And I think about our student activism, their interests, their drive, and I constantly say they make us better. They make me better, they make us all better each and every day. And what you want to make sure is that they just keep on the path in an informed way.
Exactly. And be prepared for the bumps and bruises, but just keep your eye on the prize.
Exactly. So I want to end up with just talking a little bit about leadership. It's one of the ways we always end this series. And about a year ago, we asked our Albright Fellows if they could talk to us about what they thought were important qualities for leaders for tomorrow. And they thought, they listed integrity, honesty, trustworthiness, inclusiveness. It's interesting to me because I would have thought naturally that those were qualities that we wouldn't necessarily need to call out. But I think it's in an era when it's so important to actually name them. One of our students, she wrote, "The leaders of the future should be concerned about people, their shared humanity, and not just shared national, religious, or political identity." And the statement just, to me, resonated with what your life has been about. Can you just share with us what you consider as some of the important qualities of leadership moving forward?
I think, for starters, we're what we just spoke about, I think an absorptive capacity or a resilience to be able to have a goal, to not necessarily achieve that goal in the short term, to take some hits along the way, and to just never lose sight of why it's important to strive for that. So I think resilience is hugely important. And then I think the best leaders never lose the ability to step into the shoes of other people. It's very easy, particularly when you get into lofty positions, for example, to be a university president and to forget what it's like to be a student walking onto a campus for the first time. But from everything I hear about your leadership, that's something that you still remember, just how intimidating it can be to be at a place like Wellesley. So too, when you become the president or even the UN ambassador, it's been a long time since you've been worrying about whether you have health insurance.
That's right.
But to be able to remember, what would that feel like?
Right.
What would it be like to be watching the vote on the Senate floor and being in that kind of suspense about whether or not you're going to be able to take your kids to the physician next month for their checkup, or to get a cancer treatment, or whatever it is. And that ability to just be able to step into shoes that you no longer wear or you have never worn. I think that's the essence of leadership.
Yeah, that empathy.
That empathy.
Really, and connection.
Mm.
Well, thank you. It is a critically important message. And Ambassador Power, thank you. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your service and for your ongoing contributions. And please come back.
I will come back.
Okay.
I love it here.
Thank you.
Thank you.